First, usual question. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Never trust sound system. Well, thanks for the warm welcome. Appreciate that. And so I guess I've given thousands of talks over the years. I don't think I've ever seen one advertised the way it was on the marquee, if I read it correctly. Was it free sex and lies or something like that? I guess that's what you're here for. So that's an Iowa custom or what? Well, get serious. The individual who's the more or less the symbol of human rights in the United States is Martin Luther King, whose achievements, of course, are commemorated every January. More than any other single individual, he raised concern for human rights to public consciousness. He's commemorated for a narrower but highly significant achievement, gaining elementary civil rights for blacks a century after the formal end of slavery. But his concerns were far broader than that. And even that achievement, though very real, was tarnished by the aftermath, rather as the termination of slavery was. Today, it's enough to look at the disgraceful record of incarceration, de facto school segregation, social indicators generally, to see how far we are from overcoming one of the two crimes that led Thomas Jefferson to say that I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever. The other crime, of course, was the original sin, the fate of that hapless race of Native Americans, which we are exterminating with such merciless and perfidious cruelty. Those are the words of John Quincy Adams towards the end of his life, when the intellectual father of Manifest Destiny recanted his own crimes, and not only Indian removal and extermination, but also slavery, which he called among the most heinous sins of this nation, for which I believe God will one day bring it to judgment. His recantation had no effect. Slavery remained intact, and the extermination continued in full ruthlessness, and its current residue is another shameful tale. Well, none of this is ancient history. It's all very much alive right at this moment. So the major scholarly work on the roots of the Bush Doctrine by the very highly regarded historian John Lewis Gaddis traces the Bush Doctrine admiringly to his hero, the grand strategist John Quincy Adams, who established the principle that has guided our leaders ever since. Gaddis points out pretty accurately the principle that expansion is the path to security, whether it's defending ourselves from imminent attack by Saddam Hussein, or as in Adams's case, defending ourselves from what were called runaway Negroes and lawless Indians by conquering Florida in the brutal massacre that's celebrated as the first Seminole War, incidentally also the first executive war in violation of the Constitution. It's another principle that remains alive and well to the present, and we may see more of it pretty soon. History has a long shadow. For those who hold the clubs, it's always convenient to dismiss it as antique and boring as we march on to a glorious future. Well, the victims don't have that luxury, and those who want to understand something about the world should not indulge in that fantasy either. But let me turn to King's broader legacy, which is very rich. Actually, thinking about it elicits many thoughts about the successes and the failures of the unending struggle to defend and expand human rights, including some lessons that are of particular value and import for right now. Actually, it's not very easy to be too optimistic about the world and the directions in which it's heading, but there are encouraging developments, and they should be recognized. One promising tendency is the slow evolution of a human rights culture among the general population. That accelerated sharply from the 1960s, when the popular ferment of those years had a very important civilizing effect on the society in many domains, very different culture from what it was. One significant development is a greatly heightened concern for human rights. That includes the rights of minorities, of women, and of future generations. That's the driving force of the environmental and anti-nuclear movements that had become great significant forces in later years after the 60s. And both of them are concerned quite literally with threats to human survival that are all too real. These achievements build on earlier progress in formulating standards, universal standards of human rights. The most important of them is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. That's the critical modern example, first effort to formulate a serious universal standard. Well, unfortunately, it's necessary to stress the word formulate. Implementation is a very different matter. The Universal Declaration is a statement of principles. The idea was that they would reach the stage of implementation only with what are called enabling conventions established by the General Assembly, ratified by governments. They reach the stage of potential implementation with those enabling conventions, and the next, once they're ratified, at that point, the governments are formally subject to the principles, and from then on, it's the responsibility of citizens. Their task is to ensure that the fine words do not remain what James Madison once called a parchment barrier against tyranny and oppression. The task of citizens is to compensate for the lack of external enforcement mechanisms. The specific success of the civil rights movement was to strengthen the parchment barriers, at least in some domains, primarily elements of racial discrimination and ugly repression. And it had a larger success, too, which was to awaken concerns over a far broader range. Well, giving real substance to the rights guaranteed by the Universal Declaration is a lot harder even than doing so for domestic law, which is not all that easy. Nevertheless, the Universal Declaration does stand as an important achievement, and it ought to serve as it ought to serve as a basis for further progress. However, there are certain illusions about it that ought to be dispelled. One major illusion is that it is what are called third world relativists, or communist powers, that reject the universality of the Universal Declaration, which is defended with vigor and courage by the West, primarily its stalwart leader in Washington. Well, it is true that outside the West, there were some who dismissed the Universal Declaration with contempt, as, for example, just a collection of pious phrases. That's Soviet UN delegate Andrei Vyshinsky back in 1948. And his cynical attitude is well known in the West, but not that of Ronald Reagan's UN ambassador, Jeane Kirkpatrick, who was recently honored by Condoleezza Rice as one of the stellar figures of American diplomacy. For Kirkpatrick, the Universal Declaration, she said, is a letter to Santa Claus. Neither nature, experience, nor probability informs these lists of entitlements, which are subject to no constraints except those of the mind and appetite of their authors. Kirkpatrick was deriding the socioeconomic and cultural provisions of the Universal Declaration, which have exactly the same status as the civil and political rights that the United States claims to uphold, and I stress the word claims. But these socioeconomic provisions are rejected and cultural provisions are rejected by the leader of the free world, and quite explicitly. We should be aware of the fact that the United States has one of the worst records in the world, even in formal ratification of the enabling conventions that put some teeth into the words. Just to take one example, the Convention on the Rights of the Child was adopted by the United Nations in December 1989 and has been ratified by every country in the world with two exceptions, the United States and Somalia. Somalia has no functioning government. Another example is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. That's the leading treaty for the protection of the subcategory of rights that the West claims to uphold. I'm quoting from a report, the joint report of Human Rights Watch and the American Civil Liberties Union on U.S. non-compliance with that covenant. It was, in fact, ratified after a long delay, but only with provisions added to render it inapplicable to the United States. The Human Rights Watch ACLU report concludes that ratification was an empty act for Americans. Actually, their report understates the case. The United States government has had a principled objection to ratification of enabling conventions. Very few have been ratified at all, and as far as I'm aware, every one of them has been rendered inapplicable to the United States by one or another device. That also includes the UN Convention Against Torture. That's a topic of considerable discussion recently, since it was effectively rescinded by the Bush administration in brazen disregard of international law and even congressional legislation. You'll recall, I'm sure, that when the president signed the McCain Amendment banning all forms of torture, he quietly added a so-called signing statement declaring that he would ignore it as he sees fit. And he did the same a few weeks later when he signed the revised Patriot Act, but very quietly issued a signing statement explaining that he would not be bound by the law's requirement that the president inform Congress of any use of the extraordinary powers that are granted. That action passed virtually without report, actually without any report in the national press. The rulings of Bush's Justice Department permitting torture have been bitterly condemned by civil libertarians and by the legal profession. One of the most outspoken critics was a well-known constitutional law specialist, Sanford Levinson. He was writing in the Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, venerable, respectable academy. He went so far as to compare Bush's Justice Department to the Nazis. It's pretty extreme. But Levinson also pointed out that there is some basis for the Justice Department rulings authorizing torture. Washington did ratify the Anti-Torture Convention, but only after the Senate rewrote it and provided what Levinson calls more interrogator-friendly definitions of torture than in the convention. That's a version that's now being used by the president's legal advisors in justifying the practices in Guantanamo, Iraq, Afghanistan, and who knows where else. Not to speak of unknown numbers sent by so-called rendition to countries where torture's virtually guaranteed. But even that understates the case. One of the many outraged condemnations of the Justice Department rulings on torture was by the dean of Yale Law School, Dean Harold Coe. He was Assistant Secretary of State, and in that capacity, he had presented Washington's denunciation of all forms of torture to the international community. And after the recent revelations, Coe said that the notion that the president has the constitutional power to permit torture is like saying he has the constitutional power to commit genocide. Unfortunately, the same legal advisors of the president should have very little difficulty arguing that the president does indeed have that right. The U.S. did ratify the Genocide Convention after 40 years, but with the usual reservation, inapplicable to the United States. That matter reached the World Court recently in the context of NATO bombing of Serbia, when an international tribunal was established to try war crimes in the Balkan areas, and a group of international lawyers presented a brief to the tribunal requesting it to investigate NATO crimes during the bombing of Serbia. They presented documentary evidence that had been recorded by the major human rights organizations, and in fact, including admissions by the NATO command. Well, the prosecutors rejected the request without investigation. That's in violation of the statutes of the tribunal. They simply stated that they accept NATO assurances of good faith. Well, Yugoslavia then brought charges to the World Court invoking the Genocide Convention, and the United States excused itself on the grounds of its self-exclusion from charges of genocide. And the court, keeping to its statutes, accepted this argument. So the case has proceeded against the other NATO powers, but the U.S. is excluded because evidently the president is authorized to commit genocide. Well, we might add now that we do have an authoritative account of why the United States bombed Serbia in 1999. It comes from Strobe Talbot, now director of the Brookings Institution, but in 1999, time of the bombing, he was in charge of the State Department Pentagon team that supervised the diplomacy in the affair. And he wrote the introduction to a recent book by his director of communication, John Norris, which presents the position of the Clinton administration at the time of the bombing. And here's what Norris writes. Norris writes that it was Yugoslavia's resistance to the broader trends of political and economic reform, not the plight of Kosovar Albanians, that best explains NATO's war. In brief, they were resisting absorption into the U.S.-dominated international socioeconomic system. Well, Talbot adds that thanks to John Norris, anyone interested in the war in Kosovo will know how events looked and felt at the time to those of us who were involved in the war, actually directing it. This authoritative explanation will come as no surprise at all to students of international affairs who are more interested in fact than rhetoric, and it will also come as no surprise to those familiar with intellectual life that the attack continues to be hailed as a grand achievement of humanitarian intervention, despite massive Western documentation to the contrary, and now an explicit denial at the highest level, which will change nothing. It's not the way intellectual life works. There are other examples of self-exemption from core principles of international law, also of very crucial contemporary relevance. Should be on the front pages right now. One of them arose in the case that was brought to the World Court by Nicaragua against the United States. Nicaragua's case was presented by a Harvard law professor, Abram Chase, former legal advisor to the State Department, but most of his case was rejected by the World Court on the grounds that when Washington accepted World Court jurisdiction in 1946, it excluded the United States from prosecution under multilateral treaties, international treaties, among them the United Nations Charter, which is the foundation of contemporary international law. So therefore, the U.S. can't be charged with violations of that before the World Court. And the court accepted that and restricted its deliberations in the Nicaragua case to what's called customary international law and a very narrow bilateral U.S.-Nicaragua treaty. But even on these very narrow grounds, the court charged Washington with the technical words are unlawful use of force. In lay language, that means international terrorism, and ordered it to terminate the crimes and operations, which would go a long way toward paying the debt, the huge debt that's strangling Nicaragua. The court judgment was affirmed by two Security Council resolutions vetoed by the Reagan administration, which went on to escalate the terrorist war with a devastating impact on the brutalized country, left a disaster which has become much worse since the U.S. took over again in 1990. It's now the second poorest country in Latin America. The first is Haiti. Haiti happens to be the leading beneficiary of U.S. military intervention in the 20th century and is the poorest country. Nicaragua and Guatemala vie for second place in the ranking of amount of U.S. military intervention, and also vie for second place in terms of poverty in the hemisphere. And actually that point generalizes and would also be taught and should be taught in schools in a country that values its freedoms, certainly in universities. Well, the relevant point here, however, is different and is very relevant, namely that the World Court correctly recognized that the United States is self-exempted from the fundamental principles of world order. It's what we call an outlaw state or a rogue state when we're an axis of evil or something, when we're talking about people we don't like. Well, it would seem to follow, if you think it through, that Washington is entitled to commit aggression as well as genocide. Actually, the concept of aggression is quite well defined. It was defined clearly enough by Justice Robert Jackson. He was the chief of counsel for the prosecution at Nuremberg, and his definition was restated in an authoritative General Assembly resolution. According to Jackson, here's Jackson's words. At Nuremberg, he said, an aggressor is a state that commits such actions as invasion of its armed forces, with or without a declaration of war, of the territory of another state, or provision of support to armed bands formed in the territory of another state, or refusal to take in its own territory all the measures in its power to deprive those bands of all assistance or protection. Well, the first provision very clearly applies to the U.S.-UK invasion of Iraq. The second provision equally explicitly applies to the U.S. war against Nicaragua, although we might give Washington the benefit of the doubt and consider the Reagan administration to be guilty only of the lesser crime of international terrorism on a huge scale. At the time of the Nicaragua decision, the United States was one of three countries that had rejected World Court judgments. Reagan's two companions were the terrorist dictators of Libya and Albania, Muammar Gaddafi and Enver Hoxha. But by now, Washington stands in splendid isolation, since Libya and Albania have complied with the final judgments of the court. Another thing to be proud of. The official explanation, there was an official explanation for Washington's self-exemption from the rule of law in the Nicaragua case. It was presented by the State Department legal advisor, Abram Sofair. He said, the majority of the world often opposes the United States on important international questions. So therefore we must reserve to ourselves the power to determine which matters fall essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of the United States as determined by the United States. In this case, international terrorism or maybe aggression that practically destroyed the targeted country. That's 20 years ago. And again, in a country that valued its freedom, all of this would be taught in every school, and I'd be wasting my time telling you about it because you'd all know it by heart. Well, it's a remarkable comment on Western civilization that none of this can even enter public discussion, or almost all scholarship for that matter, in the United States or in the West quite generally. And that's the residue of a deeply rooted imperial mentality that grants Western powers the right to crush anyone they want under their jackboot. Well, it's a pretty strong statement, so you ought to ask whether it's justified, and it's easy to test. Simply investigate the coverage and commentary on any relevant matter. So take, say, the current war in Iraq. Investigate it, and you'll quickly get the answer. There is the discussion across the spectrum of the war in Iraq is about at the level of a high school newspaper reporting on the local football team. The question is, how are we doing? Are there too many injuries? Did the coach make a mistake? Should we replace the coach, as a leading general just announced today? And what are the chances for victory? I mean, that's the range of questions that are debated. Criticism is called, what we call criticism is saying the coach made a mistake, should have put in a different quarterback or something. There are questions that go beyond those narrow restrictions, and we're very well aware of them when enemies resort to force. So take, say, the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. We didn't restrict ourselves to that spectrum. But for ourselves, such questions are under an absolutely strict taboo. And that's a really remarkable level of discipline in a free society when there's no costs associated with telling the truth. Of course, we're not alone. The Soviet press was about the same during the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, which I had an interview a week or two ago with a reporter from Poland, from Poland's leading journal, and this came up, and I asked him if he'd read the Russian, of course he had, reports in, say, in Pravda on the war in Afghanistan, if he noticed any similarity to U.S. reporting on Iraq. He just laughed. Of course, they're the same. Should be ashamed of ourselves for that, among other things. Well, in particular, under a strict taboo in reporting on Iraq or talking about it is the issue of aggression. So you might search to find any mention of the judgment of Nuremberg. There's a judgment. There's a definition of aggression, clearly applies. And there's a judgment, namely that aggression is the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole. That is everything that follows. All the evil in the tortured land of Iraq that flowed from the U.S.-UK invasion. That includes Abu Ghraib, the vastly worse war crimes in Fallujah, the sectarian violence that's been stimulated for the first time in Iraq's history, and in fact everything else that's happened under the U.S.-British military occupation. Well, in the light of such facts as these, namely the total taboo on any mention of these topics, it might seem a little beside the point to discuss adherence to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but let me continue nonetheless. The principles and application are very significant today. The Universal Declaration had three sections. First is civil and political rights, second, socioeconomic rights, and the third is cultural rights. Well, the United States flatly opposes the second two categories. Its opposition to cultural rights was underscored once again at the United Nations last October when the U.S. and Israel alone voted against a treaty to protect cultural diversity. Reporting. U.S. opposition to the socioeconomic provisions of the Universal Declaration is even more profound. The leading academic specialist on these matters is Philip Alston. He writes that after a brief detour caused by popular pressure in the 1970s, under Reagan, U.S. human rights policy returned to, I'm quoting him, to the unqualified rejection of economic, social, and cultural rights as rights. That means unqualified rejection of 2/3 of the Universal Declaration. And it should be stressed again that these provisions have exactly the same status as others. That has never been in question since the Universal Declaration was approved in 1948. It was just emphasized again at the September 2005 UN World Summit. The U.S. government formally agreed, but rejects the principle. It's important here to stress the word government. On this, as on a host of major issues, there's a huge gulf between public attitudes and public policy. Another thing that should concern us. In fact, both political parties and mainstream discussion are well to the right of the general public on crucial issues, a whole range of them. On social programs, public attitudes have been pretty stable for a long time and highly supportive of the socioeconomic provisions of the Universal Declaration. Just to quote the main one, everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family. It's 1948, so forget the sexist language. That includes food, clothing, housing, and medical care and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. That's a fundamental human right. Well, on these matters, as on many others, the public firmly rejects what are called the moral values of the Bush administration, which has effectively rejected these rights once again last April, when Washington was the sole, I'm quoting, the sole dissenter in separate votes of 52-1 on UN resolutions on the right to food and the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. Something else that passed without notice and is consistent over a long time. Well, right a month before those votes, and this did get publicity, the Undersecretary of State Paula Dobriansky, in charge of human rights in the administration, she presented the State Department's annual report on human rights around the world. And she affirmed eloquently that promoting human rights is not just an element of our foreign policy, it's the bedrock of our policy and our foremost concern. Plenty of publicity to that, but not to something else. Dobriansky had explained her concept of human rights when she served in a similar capacity in the Reagan and Bush #1 administrations. She sharply criticized what she called myths about human rights, the most salient of them being the myth that so-called economic and social rights constitute human rights, quoting. So she denounced the effort to, as she put it, obfuscate human rights discourse by introducing these spurious rights, which are entrenched in the Universal Declaration, but a mere letter to Santa Claus, preposterous, dangerous incitement, according to the Reagan and Bush administrations, who are at the extreme of the spectrum, but a very narrow spectrum, which is far to the right of the large majority of the public. Well, actually, the public can do a lot about this, not only in the political arena, which is crucial, but even in personal behavior. There are many illustrations. One illustration, very pertinent here, initiated by students around the country, is the Students Against Sweatshops movement, which calls on universities to restrict purchases of apparel to companies that have been designated sweatshop-free by a national monitoring organization. That's already had a meaningful impact on enforcing some of the rights that are guaranteed in words by the Universal Declaration. And I understand that the movement is very much alive right here. There's a broader initiative that's just taking off now. It's called Alo Novo, A-L-O-N-O-V-O. You can look it up on the internet. It's a highly ambitious and very well-planned program to monitor corporate responsibility in many dimensions. Decent working conditions, health, ethical responsibilities, whole range of things, to monitor them and enforce them. Enforce them by mass consumer action, organized mass consumer action, which could lead to many other important directions too. And there are many other possibilities. I mean, we don't lack choices, even very conservative choices like these. Going back to Martin Luther King, he was greatly honored, rightly of course, for his leading role in bringing the United States into partial conformity with the civil and political rights of the Universal Declaration, but his concerns went way beyond that. He was assassinated, remember, when he was taking part in a strike of sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee. At that time, he was in the midst of trying to organize a poor people's movement, which could have led to some effort to give some substance to the socioeconomic provisions of the Universal Declaration. Things like that are happening right now around the country, as you know. Well, mainstream opinion did honor King, finally, when he was condemning the racist sheriffs in Alabama, but not when his call for justice and freedom reached too close to home. Then he was condemned or simply disregarded. Since King's assassination, the violations of the socioeconomic provisions of the Universal Declaration right here in the United States have become much more acute. The country has passed through an unusual period of its economic history, I think unique. Since the Second World War, there have been two major phases of the economy in the U.S. and worldwide. The first phase, from the end of World War II up to the mid-70s, is often called by economists the golden age of American capitalism. During those years, economic growth reached its highest level ever for a sustained period, and furthermore, the growth was egalitarian. The lowest fifth of the population did as well, actually slightly better than the highest fifth. Furthermore, social indicators, which are the general measure of the health of the society, social indicators steadily improved, and they very closely tracked economic growth, if you look. From the mid-1970s, that pattern has reversed. State policy turned to what's called neoliberal measures. Economic growth has continued, but it's been highly inegalitarian. At the onset of the neoliberal era, it's now around 30 years ago, real wages in the United States were the highest in the industrial world, and working hours are about the lowest, as one would expect in the richest society in the world with incomparable advantages. Well, that situation is now reversed. Real wages for the majority have largely stagnated or declined, and they're now close to the lowest level among industrial societies. Working hours are now about the highest. The relatively weak benefit system has also declined. Incomes have been maintained only by extending working hours, often for two members of the household, well beyond comparable society. Meanwhile, inequality has soared. It's a vast change from the preceding quarter century. What about social indicators? As I said, they closely tracked economic growth during the first phase up to the mid-70s. Since then, they've declined. The last figures available are the year 2000, and by then they had declined to the level of 1960. It's worse now. The number of people who go hungry because they can't afford to buy food rose to over 38 million in 2004. That's 12% of households. It's an increase of 7 million in 5 years. Just as the government reported those figures, the House Agricultural Committee voted to remove funding for food stamps for 300,000 people and to cut off school lunches and breakfasts for 40,000 children, which is only one, unfortunately, typical illustration of the moral values of the political leadership that we're supposed to admire. Well, the results of all of this are hailed as a healthy economy and a model to other countries. Alan Greenspan, who presided over most of it, is treated with reverence for having brought about these achievements. And he's very frank and honest. He explains their source. He attributes his achievements to what he calls growing worker insecurity, thanks to the anti-labor measures that were enforced since the Reagan years. So as Greenspan explained proudly to Congress, growing worker insecurity makes it possible for employers to keep labor costs low without protest, and that's contribution to what's called the health of the economy, according to standard doctrine. Well, an important question is why the public tolerates this sharp attack on their fundamental rights. And several devices have been used to bring this about, most of them quite conventional. One is just to inspire fear. It was a technique that was manipulated with great effectiveness by the Reagan administration. There's a panic button pushed every couple of years. And again, today, that's worth an extended discussion, but there's no time for that now, so I'll put it aside. Another device, which has actually been refined to a high art in the current administration, is to shift the political arena from issues that are of primary concern to people, like, say, health care, or for many people, just food to eat, to shift issues from there to what are called cultural issues. And that's very welcome to concentrated wealth and power. Actually, on social and cultural issues, the values of corporate CEOs are what are generally called liberal, not very different from college professors. But they don't care much if political managers can organize voting blocks to oppose gay rights and abortion and evolution theory and other such matters, as long as they can then ram through social and economic measures to benefit concentrated privilege and keep the rest of the population in their place. And that's what's been going on for years. It's been necessary to remove the substance from formal democracy, and that has been done with great enterprise and skill, including quite remarkable deceit, some pretty good records of it. All of this is a very powerful attack on the political and civil rights of the Universal Declaration that Western relativists claim to uphold, not to speak of the socioeconomic rights and cultural rights. Actually, the November elections, last November 2004, they illustrate the achievements very well. They're pretty remarkable. Well, as usual in recent years, the electoral campaigns were run by the public relations industry. In its regular vocation, it sells toothpaste, lifestyle drugs, automobiles, and other commodities. Its guiding principle is well known to us. Its guiding principle is deceit. The task of advertising is to undermine the free markets that you're taught to revere in economics courses and general culture. These are mythical entities in which informed consumers make rational choices. Well, in such systems, if they existed, business would simply provide information about their products. Cheap, easy, very simple. So GM would put up a 5-minute ad saying, here's our models for next year. That's a market. But it's no secret that they don't do anything of the sort. On the contrary, business spends hundreds of billions of dollars a year to project imagery to deceive and delude consumers. We all know that. I mean, uncontroversially, that's what advertising's for, not providing information. So the automobile industry doesn't simply make public the characteristics of next year's models. It devotes huge efforts to deception, featuring sex objects, cars climbing sheer cliffs to a heavenly future, and everything you see on television. Furthermore, as the great American social and economic analyst Thorstein Veblen pointed out a long time ago, one of the primary tasks of business propaganda is what he called fabrication of consumers, creating wants. That's a device that, in his words, helps induce all the classic symptoms of state-based totalitarianism: atomization, political apathy and irrationality, the hollowing and banalization of purportedly democratic political processes, mounting popular frustration, and so forth. Very visible all around us. Actually, the basic observation is as old as Adam Smith. He warned that the interests of merchants and manufacturers are to deceive or even to oppress the public, as they have done on many occasions. Now they're served by major industries that have been created for these purposes. Probably a sixth of gross domestic product goes to marketing, most of which is just deceit and delusion to undermine markets. The general point is that informed consumer choice, informed choice by rational consumers, is about as realistic as the famed entrepreneurial initiative and so-called free trade, mostly myth. Except for temporary advantage, these fanciful doctrines of economic theory have never been acceptable to those who dominate society or long tolerated, unless they gain something from it selectively in the short term. It's what you discover if you look at the so-called free trade treaties right away. Well, when they're assigned the task of selling candidates, the public relations industry just reflexively resorts to the same techniques as in marketing commodities, or it could be more precise, other commodities. Deceit is used to undermine democracy, just as it's the natural device for undermining markets. And voters do appear to be aware of the travesty. So on the eve of the year 2000 elections, a large majority of the electorate dismissed them as just an extravaganza run by rich contributors, party managers, and the public relations industry, which trains candidates to project images and produce empty phrases that might win some votes. More than 60% of regular voters felt that politics in America is generally pretty disgusting. There's a Harvard University project that monitors voter attitudes reported that Americans' feeling of powerlessness has reached an alarming high in the year 2000, well beyond earlier levels. Very likely, these are the reasons why the population at large seemed to have very little interest in the stolen election that exercised educated sectors. And it may be the reason why they paid very little attention to the plausible charges about fraud in 2004. I suspect that the reason is that if you're flipping a coin to pick the king, you don't care very much if the coin turns out to be biased. I should say that this cynicism about politics is so deeply rooted that it's simply presupposed in commentary. Just before coming here, I went through the torture that I go through when I'm in hotels and turned on CNN, and there was some report of the big demonstrations all over the country today, and they reported that they went through a number of political figures who took part in the demonstrations. But the only question they could ask, that it should occur to an educated person to ask, is, will it help them get votes or won't it help them to get votes? And like the idea that they might be doing it because they believe in it is so remote from consciousness, you can't even bring it up. It has nothing to do with politics. Politics is a way of manipulating the public, like advertising on TV is a way of deceiving them, undermining markets. Just taken for granted. Even ask it. The idea that they could mean it is just inconceivable. How can you be doing something sincerely? It's all a way of deceiving the public. Voters, in fact, have very little awareness of the stands of candidates on issues. And it's not because of lack of interest or mental incapacity, but because elections are designed that way. So in 1992, 30% only were aware of the stands of the candidates, and that's been declining. By the last election, 2004, about 10% of voters said that they were voting on the basis of the agenda, ideas, and policies of the candidates, and incidentally, about those, they were grossly misinformed. The campaigns are designed to ensure that most people would vote on what the PR industry calls qualities or values, which are designed and projected with great care and have about as much authenticity as imagery in toothpaste ads. It's very striking, if we're willing to look at ourselves, to compare elections here with elections in the poorest countries in the hemisphere. So take, say, Bolivia. They just had an election. And that was an election. The mass of the population participated. There were popular groups, mass popular groups. Didn't just show up to push a lever. They're working all the time, on all sorts of issues, privatization of water, or everything you can imagine. And they showed up. They knew what the issues were. The issues were serious ones. And they actually elected a candidate from their own ranks. I mean, that is so far beyond inconceivable here that we can't even describe it. What we do here is vote for stick figures. Last election was a particular caricature. Two men born to wealth and political power, went to the same elite university, joined the same secret society, where you're trained to be a member of the ruling class, were able to run because they're supported by approximately the same concentrations of private power, had very similar positions to the extent that you could even determine them. It was almost impossible to determine them. We would laugh if that took place in another country. This is the richest, most privileged country in the world. And Bolivia is the poorest country in South America. I mean, we should be outraged, ashamed. I mean, no reason to even permit this. Well, the propaganda has been so effective that in the year 2004, Bush voters tended to believe that he shared their beliefs on major issues, even when the party platform explicitly rejected them. There's one striking case is the Kyoto Protocols on global warming. As you know, the U.S. rejected them, almost alone in the industrial world. But these are so strongly supported by the population that a majority of Bush voters thought that he supported them. And there are many such examples. And the same, incidentally, is largely true of Kerry voters. So Kerry was hardly responding to the concerns of his constituency, either on international or domestic issues. There's striking examples of this. They may recall that the last presidential debate, a couple days before the election, was supposed to be on domestic issues. Well, for most of the population, if you look at polls, the main domestic issue is the health crisis. People can't pay for health care. They're worried about it. It's running right at the top of the polls, has been for a long time. There was a New York Times report on the debate, October 28th, and it reported accurately that Kerry took pains to say that his plan for expanding access to health insurance would not create a new government program. And it went on to explain, the reason is because there is so little political support for government intervention in the healthcare market in the United States. Only an overwhelming majority of the population, as polls regularly show. But that's not political support. Now, these are all very polite ways of saying what's presupposed, that the pharmaceutical and financial industries and other private powers are strongly opposed, so there's no political support. It's politically impossible. The will of the public is simply banned from the political arena, and we take it for granted. So it's just reported flatly, no political support. Well, Bush won large majorities of those who are concerned with the threat of terror and what are called moral values. But these results, again, tell you virtually nothing. Popular judgments about terror are another tribute to marketing by government and media. The public is hardly aware of the preference of Bush planners for policies that sharply increase the threat of terrorism, as they're well aware, is just not a high priority for them. It's very easily demonstrated. What about moral values? Well, you learn what you need to know from the business press the day after the election. Business press reported the air of euphoria in boardrooms and corporate lobby offices. It's not because CEOs oppose gay marriage, but because, to quote, U.S. business expects a clear run now that the political landscape is tilted in favor of corporate America more dramatically than at any period in modern American history, quoting the business press on the moral values. Well, in general, it just means very little to say that people vote on the basis of moral values. So the question is, what do they mean by the phrase? That's actually not studied very much as far as I know, but there are some studies, and what they show, there's some interest in one of the few polls that asked this question. I'm quoting from it. When the voters were asked to choose the most urgent moral crisis facing the country, 33% cited greed and materialism, 31% selected poverty and economic justice, 16% named abortion, and 12% selected gay marriage. In another poll, when voters were asked to list the moral issue that most affected their vote, the Iraq War placed first at 42%, 13% named abortion, 9% gay marriage. Other studies for years reveal that among the large majorities of the population that have favored national health insurance for decades, among that large majority, most, about 80%, regard it as a moral issue. For a long time, the public has favored reducing military spending, sharply increasing social spending, that's health, education, renewable energy, support for the UN, and so on. Now, that happened again just a year ago. Right after the federal budget was announced, public attitudes were studied. They were the inverse of the budget. Where spending was going up, public wanted to go down. Where it was going down, public wanted to go up by large majorities. The facts are not reported. In fact, in that case, literally not reported anywhere in the press. Not a single report listed in the standard database. Pretty remarkable in a free society. Well, there is a hopeful element in all of this, very hopeful, in fact. Namely, the policies can be changed, and they can be changed very easily. Activism in the United States does not incur great political cost here or in other countries like ours. And the reason is that past struggles have left a legacy of freedom and of opportunity, which is shared by very few others in the world. What's happening is not the result of mysterious historical laws or fate. It all reduces to simple questions of will and choice. That's the real legacy of the civil rights movement and the activism that it inspired. And from that point on, it's just up to us. Thanks.
Okay, we're going to have about 20 minutes for questions. If you have a question, where's the microphone set up? I was told there was going to be a microphone set up. This one?
This one.
Okay.
Well, why not just give it to...
Just try to get it out of my hands.
Yeah,
okay. And
just
Professor Chomsky will...
you just hand it around. Put it down. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, if anybody, just raise your hand. Actually, the acoustics are pretty good, I think. I could repeat if you say something, if I can hear it, okay? Or there is a mic if you want to come up to it. Yeah. I can't see very okay. Yeah. Somebody right there? Yeah? Well,
I got to ask you, you're in front of me, and it really is a burning question for me, and it seems like a lot of your work is sort of focused on debunking the bias of information that's presented to us. And I just want to ask you, what do you think really happened on September 11th? Because I think about it, and it doesn't all add up to me, so I want to know what you have to say about it.
Well, to tell you the truth, I'm not one of the skeptics on that one. I mean, it's conceivable that there was... I don't think that see, if you take... there's a good reason why scientists do experiments. I mean, if you take some real-life phenomenon, like take videotapes of things happening out the window, I mean, it could be almost anything. You'll find all sorts of unexplained coincidences, impossible events, anything. That's why people do carefully controlled experiments. And even under the conditions of carefully controlled experiments, you still find it. You find unexplained coincidences, you find factors that should have been involved that nobody didn't take account of, and so on. If you want to see what it looks like, just take a look at the letters columns of any scientific journal, say Science. That's what the letters are about, things just like this. Well, you take a real phenomenon in the world, you're always going to find things like that. It's just inevitable. I mean, you could prove that the White House was bombed yesterday by looking at things that are unexplained, or, why this happened and that didn't happen, and so on and so forth. If you want to do a serious analysis of the evidence, you can. It's not a trivial matter. First of all, you've got to get sufficient training in the relevant engineering fields, civil and mechanical engineering. And that's not something you can pick up off the internet. You really have to, those are hard problems. You've got to understand them. You've got to know the details of the building constructions. I mean, there's a lot you have to know to really investigate it. If you want to investigate it, fine, but there's prerequisites. Then you have to ask yourself, well, is it worth investigating? Frankly, I'm skeptical. I mean, for the Bush administration to have done anything like that, they would have had to be literally insane. I mean, just think about it. You could never predict what's going to happen in a situation like that. Possible, Furthermore, a huge number of people would have been involved, not only in the planning and the execution, but also in the massive cover-up. Well, the chances of a leak are not small. And any leak, and they all would have been lined up before firing squads, murdered, the Republican Party's dead forever. You can say correctly that they gained from it, but that doesn't tell you a thing. Every power... I remember the first interview I gave after 9/11, an obvious answer. I said, every power system in the world is going to exploit this for their own purposes. The ones who are carrying out brutal repression will carry out still more brutal oppression. The Russians in Chechnya, the Chinese in the Uyghur provinces, Israel on the West Bank, Indonesia in Aceh, and so on. Everybody else is going to, impose modes of disciplining their population, which I'll call protection against terrorism acts or something. Sure, that's the way power systems react to an opportunity that's handed to them, to be more repressive and brutal and control their own populations better. So sure, the Bush administration will do it too. So if you ask who gained, yeah, every concentration of power in the world gained. Furthermore, there's another point. It's kind of interesting that this inquiry, this kind of 9/11 truth inquiry, has been treated really with kid gloves by the media and the government. They kind of like it. It gets a lot of publicity. It's reported all over the place pretty sympathetically. You don't get the usual tantrums and hysteria and lies and slanders that follow if you can't be ignored. If you go somewhere that strikes pretty near centers of power and what they're up to. And that's suspicious, at least. My guess is that they really do like it because it diverts attention and energy from really serious crimes that they're carrying out, which are much worse even than if they had blown up the World Trade Center. Yeah, that would have been a pretty horrible crime. But there are others that are a lot worse and that they don't want you to look at, like the war in Iraq, for example. I could say that I would not be surprised if 20 or 30 years from now, I won't be around, but you will, there's some leaks, there's some declassification of documents, which actually shows that. Actually, there are some from events 30 years ago, 40 years ago. So there are some proposals for declassification inside the Pentagon, which suggest that the government should periodically release information about the Kennedy assassination, because that will keep people from pursuing really dangerous questions and asking for Freedom of Information Act requests on things that might really expose what we're up to and so on. So let them keep to this and devote their energy to it. They won't find anything, and it won't matter anyway if they do. But it wouldn't surprise me if that's the same here. Anyway, that's my personal feeling. But if anyone thinks it's important and, that's really where priorities ought to go, there are ways of investigating it. But there are prerequisites. It's not something where you can pick up the information off the internet. Just, ask people who know something about the relevant engineering professions. It's not a trivial matter. Same with the forensic evidence. There's been a lot of fuss about the fact that nobody found forensic evidence of the bodies of the people supposedly on the planes. Yeah, they didn't find evidence of half the other people who were killed in 9/11 either. I mean, you really have to want to go into all these things seriously if you want to talk about it. My own feeling is it's kind of a diversion, but you've got to make your own judgments.
Well, I personally can bring myself to vote for John Kerry because of his support for the Iraq War. There's pretty overwhelming evidence that he actually did win the 2004 election, and not just in Ohio or Florida, but in states all over the country that all sorts of tactics were used to push people off the voter rolls, and also the electronic voting machines, Diebold, etc. And also, even in the 2002 election, Max Cleland and his opponent holding stock in Diebold machines and him getting voted out of office. I suppose as a young person, I don't have a lot of confidence in voting on the national level, and I don't know if you would like to speak to that. And if the election was stolen in both 2000 and 2004, should we only focus on our local elections and our local government and our state government? Should we almost even bother giving elections on the federal level the credence that that they deserve?
Right. That's a fair enough question. But first of all, remember, it goes on all the time. I mean, Kennedy's election in 1960 was based, mostly on voter fraud in Chicago, apparently. When elections are kind of like flipping a coin, they're like 50-50. So what usually take say the 2004 election, Bush got around 31% of the electoral vote. Kerry got 29%. If the voting in Ohio was reversed, Kerry would be in with the same percentages. But the point is, I think the problem with the election is much deeper than that. I mean, I think the public has a sort of a healthy instinct when they don't pay much attention to it, and didn't pay much attention to the pretty clearly stolen election in 2000. And the reason is there weren't any elections in the first place. They weren't real elections. So if they were stolen, well, unpleasant, but who cares? I mean, when you have candidates where you don't know what their stand is on anything, and you don't know any more about them than you know about brands of toothpaste. And when the election is designed that way, and when your attitudes, when both political parties are way to the right of your own attitudes, which is true on issue after issue, well, yeah, then it's not a very serious election. I think that's the thing we ought to be concerned about. Not, you got to get the voting machines to work right and so on, but that seems to me like a 10th order question as compared with the fact that we can't have the kinds of elections that they can have in Bolivia. I mean, that's staggering. In comparison with that, the fact that the voting machines could have been tampered with probably is small. And yes, I think young people should be concerned about elections, but concerned to make sure that we have them. Okay, then we'll worry about the rest. I mean, if the situation is such that people literally do not know the stands of the candidates, and the candidates do not come from the population, but just from sectors of wealth and power that are, portrayed with the delusion and imagery, well, yeah, then we're really in trouble. But we can change all that. I mean, we're not less able to do it than peasants in Bolivia or plenty of other places. That's outlandish. So yeah, I think young people should be concerned about elections, but about what seem to me the much more fundamental problems in the erosion of a functioning democratic system, which is really serious.
Thank you, Professor. I have a pretty broad question. You spoke roughly about a number of administrations, Reagan, both the Bushes, even Clinton administrations. Oh, sorry about that. My question falls along the lines that to those who are in charge who are breaking these rules that apply to a wide range of issues that you spoke on, particularly civil rights, what exactly are the motivations? Why exactly are they doing this? Is it greed? Is it power? Is it religious influence? Is it the ends justify the means kind of mentality?
I mean, I don't want to suggest that everyone in the position of political leadership is identical. I mean, there are differences. But there are very sharp institutional constraints in the system. I mean, you can't overlook the fact that there are very narrow concentrations of power in the society. In the corporate system, the financial institutions, the major corporate centers, they're all interlinked. Enormous influence on state power, on the media, which are just part of them, and so on. Those are institutional constraints. Now, first of all, those constraints are not, they're not fixed and eternal. They can be changed. Been changed in the past, they can be changed now. But given them, there's a lot that can be done. Like take the civil rights movement again. I mean, it did achieve significant legislative results. The March on Selma, for example, did one of the main, which was a scary affair, led Johnson to probably the main factor leading Johnson to pass the Voting Rights Act. All right, that's an achievement. I mean, today we enjoy rights, most of us, well beyond those in the 60s. I mean, women, for example, have rights that are just taken for granted now that didn't exist 40 years ago. All right, that was done. Same with minorities, same with future generations. It's no joke, the environmental and anti-nuclear movements. Yeah, those are things that were won. In fact, it's even true of freedom of speech. I mean, we're sort of taught that freedom of speech is protected in the Bill of Rights. It isn't. I mean, freedom of speech was not protected throughout American history. Pretty rotten record, in fact. It was really not until the 20th century that the Supreme Court started taking cases on freedom of speech. And what we now admire, or are supposed to admire, are mostly dissenting judgments, which were not all that great when you look at them. Freedom of speech was actually achieved a high standard in 1964, and that was in the course of the Civil Rights Movement. In the case of Times versus Sullivan, those of you who know this, that Supreme Court struck down laws of sedition that went back to 1798. Okay, that established a high standard of protection of freedom of speech. Went beyond in later judgments. Well, that puts the United States first in the world in a fundamental right. Freedom of speech is a very important right. Okay, we've got it to a level beyond, as far as I know, anyone in the world. That's partly the product of the civil rights movement. So yeah, a lot can be done by popular activism, huge amount. And the institutional structure is not graven in stone. That can be changed too. It was instituted mostly by radical judicial activism. It can be overthrown. I mean, there's no law of nature that says that what are called in the legal literature collectivist legal entities, namely corporations, should have the rights of persons. I mean, that's an outlandish attack on classical liberal ideals. Adam Smith, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson would be horrified at that idea. Well, it was instituted by courts, not legislation. It can be taken away by the public. Like there are movements right now calling for it. And the same is true of every other inequity and form of oppression and domination. Yeah, it can be removed. But even within the structures, there's a lot we can do. So it's not that we don't have choices and options. We have plenty of them. I mean, every single thing I mentioned, there's simple solutions. It's commonly said that people are always, critics are saying this is wrong and that's wrong and not telling you what to do about it. That's just a funny way of saying that they're telling you what to do about it, that I don't like the solution. I mean, take, say, the major domestic issue. Develop a national health care system like every other industrial country does, or a better one, because we can do it better than they can. That's not a very radical idea. Follow the will of the large majority of the population where the mechanisms are well understood. And, case after case is like that. So sure, plenty we can do. In fact, just about anything we feel like. We're very free thanks to these struggles of the past.
Thanks for coming to Iowa City. I sympathize with your critique of the efficacy, or I guess even existence, of an opposition party in this country. But at the same time, it seems to me that there are a lot of people right now, more and more since 2004, who are, instead of working outside, are working inside institutionalized power structures. In this case, I'm talking about the Democratic Party, and trying to kind of change the Democratic Party from the inside and turn it into an effective tool for our values and so on. And I know in the past, from having read a lot of your books, that you've been very skeptical about the possibilities to work within one of the two existing parties to make a difference that really means something to people like us. And I'm wondering if the last 4 years have changed your opinion about that at all, or if you think that these recent sort of activity on the internet with blogs and so on, and people trying to kind of get the politics more grassroots again within the institutional structure of power, if that is a serious movement, if that's something that we should...
Sure, it can be done.
What's your opinion about that?
I mean, all of these things can be done. I mean, the couple of cases that I mentioned, which is like, 2-3 things out of a huge sample, those are they are efforts to create the basis for a democratic society. I mean, the basis for a democratic society is functioning popular organizations, which are working all the time, not every 4 years in an extravaganza, but all the time. Okay, witness what the political scientists call secondary associations, just like, say, Bolivia, or like unions were, or the women's movement, or take your choice. Those are mass popular organizations that are working all the time. And yes, they may take an electoral turn, either with their own party or by changing one of the existing parties. That's a tactic, but it's part of a process of democratization. And everybody talks about democracy promotion. You read, take a look at today's New York Times, this morning New York Times, big headline on the front page. I forget the exact wording, but it says, democracy in the Arab world, the Bush administration project is faltering. Where did the project ever take place? I mean, the project was announced by the dear leader, and since we have to be North Koreans, it became true. Is there any evidence for it? Is there any example of it? All the evidence is exactly the contrary. But since the dear leader announced it, and we have to be disciplined like North Koreans, literally, okay, it's a headline, and now this project, which obviously doesn't exist, is faltering. But but we don't have to accept that, we're free. We don't have to accept it in schools and colleges and the media, anywhere in the political parties.
Do you think that the Democratic Party specifically can play an effective role in that?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, sure. It's maybe the Republican Party can be changed. I mean, these are really tactical choices. Look, I don't vote much, frankly, because I don't see much choice.
I know.
But sometimes I do. And in the past, I've sometimes voted for Republicans.
You even you advocated voting against Bush in 2004,
I voted,
correctly?
yes, I think it's important to vote against Bush in a swing state. But I didn't. But that's because, of the two choices, there was a small difference. But in a system of huge power, small differences can translate into huge outcomes. So yeah, those are the choices you have to make. The major choice is we should not allow ourselves to get into a situation where that's the only choice we can make. And that means working all the time, not showing up every 4 years and saying, vote for me or something.
Thank you.
The boss says 2 more questions, which means short answers. Polite way of saying short answers.
Yeah, so my question would be my question is, why do you think people are afraid? And
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Why do you think people are afraid? Afraid meaning, can you hear me? Hello? Y'all can hear me? Okay.
Your voice is kind of muffled. Can you hear?
Hello?
Why are people afraid?
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I understand.
Well, when I say that, I mean, like, people, when they see me, a lot of times I get judged to be a gangster, to be something with stigmatization, or affiliated with gangs. And I know a gangster when I see one, and I know a gang when I see one. And the Bush administration is as gangster as gangster can get. But hello? Yeah. But when I ask the question, why are people afraid? Because when they see me, I get harassed and attacked real quick from assumptions. But you have a Bush administration who can run rampant and can bully countries and bully our rights, and people don't do nothing to him.
Yeah.
And you go speak, and I quote truth. It's funny because I read your books. When you speak, my question is, right now you speak to like a lot of people, and I don't know how many people are going to organize. I don't know how many people are going to do anything. And the question is, why do you think they're afraid to do anything?
Why are we afraid to do anything? It's a very striking. First of all, why are Americans afraid? That's an interesting question. Fear goes way back in American history. There isn't a lot of time to talk about it, but there happens to be a really good book about it that you could look at. It's by a literary critic named Bruce Franklin. It's called War Stars. What he does is trace popular literature and popular culture back to colonial times. And, the kind of thing that people like Harry Truman were reading when they were growing up, that kind of stuff. And, real mass popular literature. And he finds some pretty striking things that go back, and we recognize them right now, but they go back to the colonial era. One of them is fear. One of the themes of popular culture, now it's television, then it was, novels. One of them is fear, the idea that we're just about to be destroyed by an overwhelming enemy. And at the last minute, some miraculous rescue takes place. A super weapon or a superhero or high school kids going up to the hills and, saving us from the Russians or whatever it may be. This is a theme that runs right through. And furthermore, it turns out that the enemy that's going to destroy us is somebody that we're, beating to a pulp. So if you go back to the early days, it was the native population and the slaves. They're going to turn on us and destroy us. Later it was, the Chinese. You think that they're laundrymen coming over here. They're actually part of an insidious plot to take over the country and destroy us. This is not a joke. Even progressive writers, like, say, Jack London, one of the leading progressive writers, he actually wrote stories, I think it was about a century ago, in which he said that we should destroy the entire population of China by bacteriological warfare, literally, because if we don't, they're going to take us all over and destroy us. And it sounds like something you're reading in the papers now. It's not an accident. This is a streak that goes all the way back. It's very deep. You can sort of see the reasons for it. I mean, when you are beating people over the head, yeah, you have a right to be afraid of them. Just yesterday, I was at a talk with Robert Fisk, who's the most, by far, the leading journalist in the Middle East for decades, and therefore almost like a deductive proof. It follows he's not allowed to appear in the American press, which he isn't. But he just wrote a really great book on a record of his own, roughly 30 years of experience, deep experience going back in time. He ended up by saying at the end of his talk, when he thinks about the hideous things that the West has been doing to the Muslim world for back as you want to go, he's kind of amazed that they haven't really done much in retaliation. 9/11 was a hideous crime and all that, but compared with what we've been doing to them for centuries, not much. And you could say the same about many others. So yes, there's a kind of a natural fear of the people you're oppressing. And you see it all through imperial history. Like the French in Algeria, when the natives rose up, the top general said, we have to exterminate all the Algerians. I mean, in the British Empire in India, there was what they call in British history the Indian Mutiny, meaning, how can these guys have a mutiny? It was a revolt, nationalist revolt in 1857. The British responded with incredible ferocity and viciousness. And there were all kind of talks about, how the Indians are raping white women and, all the usual stuff. And there's usually a little truth, even in vulgar propaganda. But there's a deep-seated fear about it. And that is constantly played up by cynical leaders. I mean, like the Reagan administration, it's particularly true in a period when you're doing things that are really harming the public. You've got to somehow mobilize them. You've got to mobilize them. The natural means is fear. So you're too young to remember, but those of you who are a little older will remember that during the Reagan years, it was literally true that every 2 or 3 years, there was a major scare whipped up. And it started with Libyan hitmen wandering around the streets of Washington to assassinate our leader, who was holed up in the White House, on his horse or whatever, wearing his cowboy boots, surrounded by tanks and so on. And then, the nutmeg capital of the world, Grenada. You can't find it on a map. It was going to be a base from which the Russians were going to bomb us, so we had to invade Grenada. Take, say, Nicaragua. I mean, it's kind of forgotten now, but in 1985, our cowboy leader declared a state of national emergency because of the grave threat to the national security of the United States posed by the government of Nicaragua. I mean, you got to laugh. They were only, you'll remember some of this, they were only 2 days from Harlingen, Texas. The Sandinista hordes coming to take us over. It's kind of like the Chinese laundrymen. And it's official state of national emergency was called. And then it was, Arab terrorists hiding behind every tree and so on and so forth. Yeah, that's one of the ways you mobilize people. I mean, there are some precedents which aren't so pleasant to think about. I won't mention them, but you can think of them. And they can lead to pretty horrible results. In fact, let me mention one of them, because it is important. Well, let's take Germany. We tend to forget that Germany in the 1920s and early 30s was the absolute peak of Western civilization. It was the center of the arts, the sciences, high culture. I mean, if somebody from the United States wanted to study in Europe, gets really study, you went to Germany. Within a couple of years, Nazi propaganda succeeded in converting the most civilized people in Western history into raving lunatics. And we know what happened. And we even know how he did it. They were imitating American commercial propaganda. You read Goebbels and the rest, they explain it. They were very impressed by how U.S. commercial propaganda was able to do what Veblen was talking about, fabricate consumers, impose totalitarian attitudes, drive people to superficial things and away from issues. They figure, okay, we can do the same thing. And they even went through the same techniques. You have to have a few simple phrases that you keep repeating over and over and drill them into people and appeal to emotions, fear and so on. It's Karl Rove, It's exactly what they say. You don't have to make it up. They tell you. Yeah. And so did Goebbels. And they got it from commercial propaganda. And it had a huge effect. I mean, hideous effect in the most civilized country in the world. Well, okay. That's the kind of thing you got to worry about. On the other hand, like I said, even the most vulgar propaganda typically, almost always, has some element of truth behind it. Otherwise, you couldn't carry it off. And yeah, there were real grounds for fear. I mean, after 9/11, I have to say, I was confident there's going to be a series of other terrible attacks like that. That's something to be afraid of. And that's exactly why you should focus on the fact that the Bush administration is consciously increasing those threats. It's not because they want the outcome, it's just because they don't care. Like the invasion of Iraq, say, is the most dramatic example. It was undertaken with the expectation that it would probably increase terror and nuclear proliferation. And in retrospect, that's just what happened. You read the CIA reports and other intelligence agencies, they say, yeah, huge increase in the threat of terror as a result of the war. Well, they don't want that outcome. It's like they don't want proliferation, but they don't care. It's not as important as, stuffing the pockets of your rich friends with dollars and waving a fist at the world. That's much more important than whether there's a threat of terror. Yes, but there is a threat. It's not unreal. In fact, U.S. intelligence now predicts, probably realistically, that a dirty bomb, not a big nuclear attack, but a dirty bomb, which is bad enough, is inevitable. Former U.S. Secretaries of Defense, like McNamara and Perry, have predicted that it's, they say, a 50% probability in the next decade. Others, like Richard Garland, a leading physicist and weapons specialist, predict in the next few years. Yeah, those are real threats. And in fact, they're well understood. And it's also understood how to do something about them. One of the lesser thing to do is security. Yeah, that's part of it, but that's the least of it. The major thing to do is stop inciting it. That's much more important. And actually, there's something more important than that too, and that's stop carrying it out. We're carrying it out. We don't talk about that part. But if we put aside the terror that we're responsible for and just look at the part that we might be the victims of, which is much smaller, the thing is to stop inciting, and that's understood. Every specialist on terror writes about that. Okay, so these are, but the real fears, and people do grow up with fears. I mean, anyone who's grown up like anyone my age, say, who grew up in an urban neighborhood, can remember these fears. Like I happened to grow up in an Irish and German Catholic neighborhood, and we were the only Jewish family. I mean, I grew up with a visceral fear of Catholics. And it took years before I could have a Catholic friend. I mean, this is the 1930s. Most of the families are pro-Nazi for understandable reasons. They're Irish and German, and but it was it's scary to be in the streets with it's like a kid on the street. So sure, you grow up with fears. A lot of them are real. I mean, you kind of grow out of them and you understand it. But cynical politicians and political leaders and others, religious leaders, can manipulate those fears and control. It's a terrific technique of control. It can have disastrous consequences. So your point is quite right. It's the kind of thing you just have to defend yourself and your children and the whole society against. Sorry, we got to stop.
I'm sorry.